is that, oh, thank you so much. This debunking works. So there have been a bunch of studies in psychology and cognitive science that have found that debunking interventions can help reduce people's reliance on misinformation, help them build resilience against future encounters with misinformation, and can really be an effective intervention. So we do have the power to address misinformation. Additionally, the best way to combat misinformation is debunking often and properly. So my hope with this workshop is that you can gain some of the tools to conduct your debunking properly and learn sort of what the best practices are, and also that we can all be inspired by the other people on this call to work together to build this visible debunking presence and to make sure that we're all working together to combat misinformation. So I think that working together, we can really have an impact in combating misinformation. So I wanted to give you a quick run of show on what to expect from this workshop. The first 15 minutes, I'm going to go through some background on how to debunk, why to debunk, when to debunk. And then for the rest of the workshop, we're going to be in breakout rooms where you can speak with any of our 9 expert science communicators and workshop your material with them. So our goal for this workshop is for you to leave with a shareable debunking content that you can post on social media. And we're hoping that by consulting with our experts and using the framework that you get from this workshop, you can make that debunking really effective and powerful. Okay, so just 2 definitions to get started. Misinformation, we're talking about false or misleading claims, and we really want to focus on scientific topics today. So scientists speak up. We generally are dealing with climate change and vaccination, but if you want to focus on something else, you're definitely welcome to do so. And we're excited to see what you come up with. With debunking, what we're working to do is unstick misinformation that someone currently holds. And rather than leaving an information void where that misinformation was, we actually want to replace it with accurate information. So in doing so, we're trying to help people make more informed decisions, and better understand the world around them. And to better understand how we should do debunking, I'm going to be drawing really heavily from the debunking handbook. I have the URL down here, so I would encourage you all to check that out. It was compiled by this group of experts who have done a lot of work on debunking techniques, and they really walk you through step by step how debunking works and the best practices for it. So I'm not an expert in this, but they are. And any mistakes today are my own. And I want to start out with this flowchart from the debunking handbook that kind of walks you through when you should debunk. And there are a few questions that you should ask about the misinformation. First, you want to pay attention to whether it's just expected or if it's already out there. If the misinformation isn't currently circulating, then you can use what's called pre-bunking. And an analogy has been drawn between this and inoculation, where what you're doing is introducing this weakened dose of the misinformation and then explaining why it's false or why it's misleading. And your goal there is to help your audience build up their cognitive antibodies so that when they encounter that misinformation in the future, they'll be more resilient to it. An example of how this works is from this paper by John Cook. So what he did is he gave participants this pre-bunking content. And in it, he explained the fake expert tactic that is often used to cast doubt about science. So specifically, he gave the example of how doctors were used to discredit the scientific evidence linking smoking with lung cancer. From there, he kind of talked more generally about how the strategy is used and then exposed the participants to misinformation involving this fake expert tactic. but now it was misinformation about climate change. And what he found is that people who had had this inoculation intervention were actually less responsive to the misinformation. And the really cool thing with this intervention is that just with this one pre-bunking material, you can actually help your audience to be immune to a wide array of misinformation. One thing we know about misinformation is there's kind of this repetitive use of the same tactics over and over again. So if you can get out ahead of those and prevent people from believing it in the first place, then you won't have to play catch up with claim after claim. Now, sometimes though, the misinformation already is out there. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should do a debunking. There are a few more questions you should ask yourself. So first of all, is this misinformation visible? If Skaterboy22 has shared a flat earther meme to his 2 followers, you don't necessarily need to quote tweet that with a debunking. And you could actually do harm because you might first of all be amplifying misinformation that people wouldn't have otherwise seen. And second of all, you might just be wasting your time, right? You have limited amounts of time and debunking capacity, and you really want to focus on where you can have a high impact. Second, you want to ask yourself whether the framing and agenda around the misinformation is fluid. So let's say you see someone sharing this misinformation that is overestimating the number of COVID cases in vaccinated people. If they aren't making really any broader claims about the efficacy of the vaccine, rather than debunking, you just need to provide the accurate information to replace that misinformation. But you don't necessarily want to kind of move into these terms of a misinformed agenda that wasn't already there. However, if the framing around the misinformation is fixed, then it's time to move forward and debunk often and properly. And one thing that's really emphasized in the debunking handbook is that often people will feel like they don't have enough skills or they might be doing harm by debunking. And there isn't a lot of evidence that that actually happens. So the authors of the debunking handbook really encourage you to, if you can, and if you know how to use this framework, to go ahead and debunk often and properly, and that you will be doing good by doing so. So I want to pause here for just 20 or 30 seconds and give you time to jot down if you already have an idea of misinformation that falls in this category. So think about if you already have a claim that you want to debunk tonight, just so you can keep it in the back of your head as we move through these next exercises. So let me give you, I'll just shut up for a couple more seconds. Cool. So if you don't have misinformation yet that you are here to debunk, we can talk about that when you move into your breakout rooms, and our experts can help you find some misinformation to debunk tonight. Okay, so once you're trying to do a debunking, you've gone through the flow chart. Your debunking is going to have 4 parts. And if I can move forward with my slide. Okay, so you're going to open with a fact. You want to make your fact as easy to understand as the misinformation was, if possible. Now, this can be tricky because science is often really complicated and there's a lot of nuance and uncertainty, and misinformation really thrives on oversimplifying things and not really acknowledging nuance. So I definitely speak with our experts about how you balance being accurate in your debunking while also making sure that your audience understands what you're talking about. Next, you want to warn about the myth. So one repetition of the myth is helpful to people updating their beliefs, but you want to make sure that you're giving a lot more airtime to the truth than the misinformation. Next, you're going to explain the fallacy. So this part is really important to help the audience see the inconsistency in the misinformation and understand why it's false. so that they can unstick it. Finally, you will reinforce the fact. So again, we want to make sure that we're emphasizing what the truth is. You also want to make sure that you're offering an alternative causal explanation. So again, we don't want to leave our audience with this cognitive void, this gap, because then the misinformation is just going to go back in there, right? We have to give them something else that explains what they're observing, that's consistent with everything else that they see. So now I'm going to show you a myth, and then we're going to walk through an example debunking. So let's say you come across this meme. It's been shared by a lot of people. The framing is fixed. Let's walk through a debunking. So it says here, the environment of Earth has been continually changing for 4.5 billion years. The idea that climate change is new or is caused by humans is nonsense. The idea is that human can fix it with a carbon tax is laughable. So two things to note really quickly about the misinformation here. First of all, there are actually a few false claims being made here. So it sometimes takes a little bit of work to identify what the misinformation you really need to address is and what's kind of the extra stuff. Second of all, a lot of misinformation will have a kernel of truth to it. So the idea that, yeah, the climate has been changing for billions of years, but that also human-caused climate change is happening right now. So in those cases, it's important to acknowledge the kernel of truth, but then also work to disentangle it from this broader misrepresentation that's happening. So let me show you how you do that. We're going to start with our fact. So, if I can. Okay, scientists observe human fingerprints all over our climate. The warming effect from greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide has been confirmed by many lines of evidence. Aircraft and satellites measure less heat escaping to space at the exact wavelengths that carbon dioxide absorbs energy. The upper atmosphere cools while the lower atmosphere warms, a distinct pattern of greenhouse warming. So again, we want to make sure that it's easy enough to understand, but that we are providing an alternate explanation. Next, we're going to directly address the myth. A common climate myth is that climate has always changed naturally in the past, therefore modern climate change must be natural also. Then we have our fallacy, and a great resource for recognizing fallacies is John Cook's taxonomy of the techniques of science denial. So I put the little shortened URL here if y'all want to write that down, or if someone wants to put it in the chat. But this is a great resource for recognizing the ways that these techniques are used. He gives detailed explanations and examples of them, and even has a game where you can practice recognizing which fallacy is being used. In this case, the fallacy is the single cause fallacy, which falsely assumes that because natural factors have caused climate change in the past, then they must always be the cause of climate change. This logic is the same as seeing a murdered body and concluding that people have died of natural causes in the past, so the murder victim must have also died of natural causes. Finally, we want to return to our fact, and we want to repeat it a few times if we can. Just as a detective finds clues in a crime scene, scientists have found many clues in climate measurements confirming humans are causing global warming. Human-caused global warming is a measured fact. So that's all there is to it. For the rest of the workshop, you're going to be working on putting your debunking into this kind of 4-part format, and then figuring out how you can present that on social media. So you'll work with our experts on doing that. And just before we move into that section, a few more notes. There's this thing about audience, that a common misconception that people have is that you are directing your debunking toward the person who is spreading the misinformation, but really it's more for other people. So first of all, it's to your followers, the people who look to you as a trusted source. And second, to bystanders. So these are people who saw the misinformation, who you want to also see your debunking so that they can evaluate it critically. And we had a really interesting conversation last week with some of our experts about how across these different social media platforms, understanding the ways that the algorithms for content recommendation work can help you to figure out kind of how to make your debunking visible to the people who saw the misinformation. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend asking our experts. And I see that there are questions in the chat. I'm going to come back to all of these at the end, and I'll also stick around after the presentation if you want to talk more about this stuff after. A few more points. It's really important to understand your audience and what specifically their barriers to belief updating might be. So whether it's misinformation familiarity, it's just been repeated a lot, or they're in a suboptimal emotional state, maybe they're acting out of fear or anger, that can affect how you might present your debunking and what points you want to emphasize. And then a couple of other things. Debunkings are most effective when they come from a trustworthy source. And you are a trustworthy source, probably, to the people who follow you on social media. One thing that I really admire about all of the experts who are on this call is the way that they've been able to build this really positive relationship with the people who follow them and cultivate this sense of trust. So one easy kind of life hack to making your debunkings more effective is to make yourself more trustworthy to your audience. Show them why they should trust you. And I'd encourage you also to ask our experts some about how they go about doing that and thinking about that sort of thing. It is sometimes useful to appeal to values, which can feel weird, especially to people who are used to science, where we really, let the data speak for themselves and remove ourselves from the story. When you're a science communicator, that can actually be kind of a pitfall because people don't really know why they should listen to you if they don't know where you're coming from, right? It's important for them to understand that you share these same priorities about the health and the safety of the people who you care about. So actually making that stuff explicit can be really helpful. It's important also to consider emotions. You're not trying to manipulate anyone emotionally, obviously, but think about whether the misinformation has been designed to provoke strong emotions, how that might affect the ways that your debunking is received, whether your debunking actually could be provoking different emotions, and just how that all plays into the effectiveness of the debunking ultimately. And then lastly, we've already talked about this kernel of truth, where you want to acknowledge it, but then explain why it doesn't fit with the bigger story. So now we're going to move into our workshop session where you get to talk with our experts. So we're going to open up breakout rooms, and you should feel free to move between the breakout rooms during this part and ask our experts for feedback on whatever you're developing. I would encourage you, since you probably won't get to talk to everyone, while our experts are introducing themselves, jot down some notes so you know who you want to talk with. And I'll hand it over to our experts now if you want to start with Will, and then we'll keep going across the top row.
Sure, absolutely. Love to start here. My name is WillYu. I stream at twitch.tv/WillYuTV. I'm currently streaming this workshop as well. On my platform, I usually talk about a wide variety of topics. But recently, something that I've loved to do is combine some of my interest and relatability in the anime, gaming, pop culture world with also my work as a science researcher. Being a first-year PhD student at Stanford University, doing most of my research in cartilage and bone tissue engineering. And so as a member of Scientists Speak Up, I thought it was really fun to be able to bring some of those misinformation and debunking workshops to my own Twitch page. And I think it's a really awesome audience to engage with because we have such a wide diversity of ideas and backgrounds coming on in here. So lovely to be here and happy to take part in this workshop.
All right, I guess I'm next. I'm Julia. I'm a first-year PhD student at Stanford in genetics, and my social media content is on TikTok, and I mostly make videos about genomics and gene editing technologies. And I would describe my approach to science communication as prophylactic. I mostly make content that kind of describes how things work with the intention of helping people understand things better so that they are less susceptible to disinformation about them if it may arise later.
My name is Ben. To the public, I define myself as a neuroscientist. To scientists, I define myself as a postdoc. I suppose I am both, but I am a postdoc here at Stanford. And my videos are all about neuroscience. I'm on TikTok, and then I recycle my TikTok videos onto Instagram. And generally, when it comes to misinformation, I will target viral videos containing any sort of scientific misinformation. If it's about neuroscience, I am very happy because it's easier to debunk. But not to sell my breakout room, but if you do join my room, I have an example from Dr. Daniel Amen, who's a very prominent psychiatrist who often gets things wrong about the brain, that he just posted a video recently that we can talk about. So we'll have fun.
All right, I guess I'm next. I go by my pseudonym Neurofoyer. I am a medical science communicator on Twitch. You can find me on the same handle and also on Twitter. Those are my two primary platforms. I'm an infectious disease specialist along with a public health scientist in the Center for Disease Control. Worked in the federal space for a long time with also engaging in humanitarian crisis settings such as Ebola and also HIV/AIDS with the PEPFAR program. So I've worked with a lot of policymakers and kind of translating clinical work to actionable policies. But in terms of a lot of the social media content, I do a lot of outreach and try to do a lot of debunking on there as well. My approach is really just focusing on the big picture for, when communicating to the public, and making sure that, not making sure that we lose the message, but making sure that we have a focused, message for the whole big picture aspect of it.
Hi, can you see me?
Yes, you're good.
Yeah, okay, sorry, because I cannot see myself. Hi, my name is Mafalda, and I'm a postdoctoral scholar at UC Riverside, and I focus in virology, and I do science communication on Instagram, and there I'm the lab notebook. And like Julia, I mostly talk about the prophylactic of science communication. So I mostly try to build trust in scientists, and I share the backstage of doing science on Instagram, basically.
Hi, I'm Noah. I am a recent graduate of Stanford. For undergraduate, I majored in medical anthropology, which makes me probably the least sciencey person here, but I also work as the communications coordinator for Voices for Vaccines. I primarily use Twitter. My handle is Michigan Noah, Michigan_Noah. And I tend to write kind of long form threads doing deep dives into issues that either have been kind of circulating maybe for a month and have not really gone very far, or kind of older myths from the pandemic that have been really, that just haven't budged. And so I try and give people a very holistic perspective. So it's not just about the facts themselves, but the mindset behind the myth, and so that they can work through it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Edward. I'm a recent graduate of Cornell, so, the better Big Red. My background is in biochemistry and in immunology, but more so in immunology, and I've been focusing on science communication relating to vaccines since about the end of 2017. Most of my content is split between my social media, which would be on Instagram and on Twitter, but I also have a blog called deplatformdisease.com, where I also do these like really long form deep dive kind of posts exploring pertinent questions about COVID-19 and the pandemic and immunology and vaccinology in general.
Hi everyone, can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So let me just make sure. Does that sound better? I think I was using the wrong microphone.
Loud and clear.
My name's Dan. I am a molecular biologist. I earned my PhD from Carnegie Mellon University and studying ribosome assembly, but I've always really been passionate about science communication. So now I work in industry, mostly working on projects pertaining to cell-based gene therapies and vaccines. And my evening and weekend projects are debunking misinformation regarding COVID and vaccines on YouTube. My channel is Debunk the Funk. And I guess my approach is generally to make topical content that gets uploaded consistently. I try to aim for 1 video a week. And I really try to engage with certain people in my audience by hosting conversations, which are really debates sometimes. Yeah, that's my thing.
Hello, I'm Nini. My background is actually in electrical engineering and neural interfaces. I completed my PhD from Cornell. And my approach is slightly a bit different. So what I do is I use a background in data science and statistics and risk analysis, which is part of my everyday job, working actually in aviation right now, to really flip people's perception of risk. So I get them to see like their own distortion, especially in, you know, what we're seeing now is an overamplification of risk. And in that way, I help them think about some of the common like misconceptions around science in ways they haven't thought before, but also in a way that aligns with their values, because we are seeing really a lot of polarization around vaccine science and misinformation. So I really like to do it in a way that integrates their value system. So it's a bit tricky, but it's grown a great platform. We're almost up to 100,000 followers on Instagram. And it's just a unique perspective because I'm good friends with Ed, actually. I talk to him, I tell him, I think it's because I don't come from a background in immunology or vaccine science that allows me to communicate with people in a different way. And it really resonates with them. So I'm looking forward to seeing you in the break room.